In recent years, his primary focus is on the metaphysics of mind and consciousness, with a special emphasis on Panpsychism. He is mostly recognized for his contributions to the development of a monistic variant of Panpsychism known as Cosmopsychism. He is currently also working on a cosmopsychist approach to the problem of meaning in life. Professor Shani, I should say welcome back to you, Jay. It's good to see you again.
Thank you, Ashil. Thanks very much. Thank you for inviting me. It's really nice to be here today. Now, of course, I'm in my house. It's always nice to be here, but as Ashil said, it's also very nice to come back and meet you again. I spent about 2 years as a postdoctoral fellow at UJ, and that was a little more than a decade ago. And yeah, really, I mean, I think many people has left since then, but a few must still be around, and I wish to thank them in particular, to thank Catherine and Henny. I remember Ashil as a student from the time, but really for giving me the chance in a very vulnerable phase of my career to feel really as part of the department, to stick around and keep my head floating. So really, I'm very happy to be back, and again, rather appreciate it.
Yeah, Ita, I'm going to hand it over to you. I'm going to turn off my video, and you can give us your talk on Cosmopsychism, combination, and coherence. Take it away.
Okay, thank you. Right, so yeah, I'll start. Most of my talk will be using. I shall use PowerPoint with a few other jumps into a few other points. Okay, so the title of my talk is Cosmopsychism, Combination and Coherence. As Ashil said, this is a topic I've been working on. It's based on a paper that is about to come next year in the Monist, in some volume that I co-edit. In some sense, I think the paper is kind of like more interesting, get into some other things that I cannot get into here, but there's a great deal of overlap. And while I really wish to speak, maybe on another occasion going beyond the so-called combination problem that we talk about so much, but in today's talk, it's still centered around this sort of problematic. But I'll try to put it in a relatively non-technical sort of way, and hopefully with appeal to different kinds of listeners. Okay, so first let me just go in brief over the structure of the argument. I'm going to argue that, well, there's a problem known as the combination problem, directed at Panpsychism. And I'm going to argue that it arises from two cardinal theoretical commitments. One of them is constitution, and the other one is inclusion. I won't say anything about them right now, but I'll come back to it later. Just to remember these terms, constitution and inclusion. My claim that the combination of the two lies at the heart of the combination problem, why it arises. And a rather familiar form of panpsychism, which more technically can be called micropsychism, endorses these commitments, and so I will argue that as a result it falls prey to the combination problem and ends up suffering from serious incoherence. In contrast, a different type of panpsychism, a more holistic version that goes by the name Cosmopsychism, is at the very least consistent with a decoupling of these two assumptions. And once constitution and inclusion are decoupled or set apart, I shall argue that the incoherence can be avoided, and therefore therefore, that I first going to argue that there are important symmetries, contrary to what many people seem to believe. The two views are not mirror images of each other. There are important symmetries between them, Cosmopsychism and Microcytism. And consequently, for Cosmopsychism, there is no insolvable so-called combination in reverse. At least that would be my claim, which I try to substantiate in this talk. Okay, so that's the argument in brief. Let's go to part one, which essentially we're just going to try to elaborate, or not elaborate really, but move quickly through a few basic concepts and touch upon some foundational issues. All right, so first let's say something about panpsychism, micropsychism, cosmopsychism. What is the meaning of these terms, what it is that we are talking about in brief? Well, panpsychism is essentially the view that consciousness is fundamental, by which it is meant that it is a basic feature of reality, not an emergent phenomenon, but something that is always already there in some form. And the other feature is actually attested by the name, panpsychism, right? Psyche is everywhere. In other words, it's all pervading and all throughout nature. So from juxtaposing these two ideas, we get the notion that all systems are either conscious themselves, yourself and me, for example, or if they're not conscious themselves, then they are constituted. The claim is that at the very least, they are constituted ultimately of conscious entities at the end of the day. So, for example, if there is this nice piece of marble that I'm holding, many of us, most of us perhaps, would tend to think that it lacks any integral consciousness, but nevertheless, the idea is that it is made of a swarm of molecules or something that would have some rudimentary form of consciousness. So that's panpsychism. Micropsychism is essentially just bottom-up panpsychism. Panpsychism that starts with the smallest of the small, with conscious electrons or whatnot, something like this, and then builds up experience from the ground up, where micro experiences presumably constitute macro level experience, and likewise micro subjects constitute macro subjects. Finally, cosmopsychism is the view that it's essentially top-down panpsychism, but not just top-down. More specifically, the upper level is the cosmos as a whole, or a cosmic mind or cosmic consciousness, which is, on that view, the ultimate ground of ordinary subjects and of their experiences. Now, there are other types of panpsychism, quite interesting, but I will not discuss them in this talk. All right? Okay, let me say something about some basic motivations for panpsychism, and think of it in the polemical context where perhaps we take physicalism or materialism as a dominant position. As many of you, perhaps all of you know, there's a famous problem known as the hard problem, which is essentially the idea that if you start with, unfeeling, unconscious matter that lacks any form of experience, the transition from such insensate matter to consciousness is inexplicable, is something that cannot be explained, something which remains mysterious and unmotivated. Now, there's another argument which plays a major role in the motivations for panpsychism, somewhat less known perhaps for the general public, but it's a very interesting argument that we can call the intrinsic natures argument. Materialism or physicalism quite often claims to be in some sense, almost just an articulation of the ontology of science, right? Well, the interesting observation here is that scientific descriptions, science itself, provides us with an incomplete picture of reality for no fault of its own. It's not because there is like some serious problem about science as such. It is rather that science provides us with the description of the extrinsicality of things, the extrinsic side of things, describing things from the outside, describing its objects in terms of their structure and behavior and dispositions, lawful tendencies. I'll give just one brief example about this lawful behavior, right? So now I hold two pieces of marble, and one of them is roughly twice as big as the other one. The mass is bigger, right? So we know by Newton's laws that if we want to, to push them at the same speed in the same direction, you would have to put more force, right, on the bigger one, simply because it has bigger mass. And so we can explain mass essentially in those structural terms, right? It has these tendencies. The body with such and such mass has the tendency to behave like this as opposed to another one, and so on. So lawful behavior, but the idea is that what is left out of this is the intrinsic nature of things. I mean, we have players that abide by certain rules, but I mean, we have behaviors, but what is it that does those behaviors? What is it on the inside? What is it intrinsically? The idea is that something here is simply left out of the game, essentially. And so, if we take these two ideas together, they provide perhaps strong ground to think that Orthodox physicalism might be a blind alley, and that we need to look seriously into other directions. And when we speak about other directions, well, one of the contenders in recent years has been Panpsychism, and that leads us to another term, which is the combination problem. Well, the combination problem is essentially the question. Okay, you say very well. We'll start with experience as the basic feature of reality, but how could micro experiences, right, experiences of atoms or whatnot, combine to constitute macro experiences, and how could micro subjects combine to constitute macro subjects? And if you get into the details in the literature, you see that the claim essentially turned into what we may call a two-quoque charge, right? Two-quoque, you too, you're no better than us, you suffer from the same problem. Essentially, the idea is that the grounding of macro level experience in the micro experiential is every bit as arbitrary, as unmotivated, unexplained, or mysterious as the grounding of experience in dead matter. So, just like the physicalist, well, the panpsychist finds himself or herself in a similar corner. That's the charge. And so that leads us to the question, well, perhaps the metaphysical grounding of ordinary consciousness, is it bound to remain beyond our grasp? And that's, of course, the challenge, the inconvenient point we find ourselves. All right, now let's say something about Cosmopsychism. First, again, by way of motivations for the view. One of them is rather straightforward, given what we already said about Panpsychism and the subject, the combination problem. I mean, especially the subject combination problem, but I leave it out of this talk, these nuances. Okay, so one motivation is simply that Cosmopsychism promises to, in a very trivial sense, dissolve the combination problem. Because macro subjects on this story, macro subjects and their experiences are grounded in cosmic consciousness, right? Not in little cells or atoms or molecules and so on. So in principle, at least, the whole narrative of bottom-up constitution may be unnecessary, and so we can make an elegant detour around it, right, and avoid the problem. Now, an independent sort of motivation, but yet another influential and important, essential one, is that It could be argued that we have independent reasons for endorsing sort of like metaphysical holistic view or metaphysical monism. And I won't get into the details of how exactly you argue for this kind of thing, but just very briefly, you could argue for that position that it is well motivated on scientific grounds. That if we look at modern science, contemporary science, and the whole ontology of quantum fields pushes in that direction. Quantum mechanics with fundamental concepts such as entanglement go against atomism and in favor of a more holistic or monistic view. Again, in physics, we can think about different types of particles which constitute the entire world we see around us as essentially being made out of symmetry breakings, where underneath the surface there are underlying symmetries which bind them together and in a fundamental unity, and so on. I mean, there are various ways this can be discerned. We can think also of philosophical motivations for thinking that all things are interconnected, and that could be argued on grounds of system theory, more in science, or other philosophical arguments. Idealists were arguing for this a long time ago, and so on. And last but not least, there are mystical and meditative experiences and altered states of consciousness, where what we find here in many, many reports is this notion that there is what is revealed in those experiences is the unity of all things, right? So, I mean, for all of these reasons, there are at least a good ground to consider monism as an attractive position and a position that may worth pursuing. And so, if we obviously combine panpsychism and monism, this simple equation leads us naturally to some form of cosmopsychism. Okay. All right. Now, when we speak about cosmopsychism, no sooner, I mean, very, very quickly, we realize that there is a problem also for cosmopsychism, which resembles the combination problem. Often it is called the decombination problem, though I prefer to call it the individuation problem for reasons that will become clearer a little later. But this problem is essentially the question, how could cosmic consciousness, right? Now we start from the top down, now we start from the universe as a whole, but how could cosmic consciousness, if it exists, how on earth could it differentiate to constitute lesser subjects that exist on their own, with their own autonomy, them and their experiences? And here again, we find a variant of the two-quark argument, right? The grounding of subcosmic experience in cosmic consciousness is every bit as mysterious or even plausible as the grounding of macro experience in the micro level. So the critique here is that cosmopsychism suffers from what is often called a decombination problem, which is a mirror image of the original combination problem, right? They just go in different directions, but they yield the same result. All right, so that was the background. Now let's move to part 2, where I'm going to consider the incoherence challenge for microcytism. Let's try to see in somewhat more detail how that problem occurs, presumably, for bottom-up panpsychism. Okay, well, first thing I want to say something about two rival interpretations of the combination problem. What is its source and what does it constitute? One of them is a view I call the no-necessitation view. That's a very familiar sort of way of thinking about the problem. And the idea is that the combination problem consists, the heart of the problem, right? It consists in the absence of a priori necessitation. There's no, in the fact that there's no necessitation of macro experiential facts, right? Or experiences from micro experiential facts. So lack of a priori necessitation, that means that you could have, it's all very nice to postulate experiences down at the bottom levels, but it is still possible that our own world would be completely, the familiar world, right, of macro objects and animals and people would be completely devoid of of subjects, of experiencing subjects. It is often illustrated with the idea of panpsychist zombies and the notion that such zombies are conceivable and possible in such a world. And so that macro level experience remains unexplained, remains an arbitrary posit or unexplained reality. Now, the second approach says, well, it's not merely that there's a lack of necessitation, right? That we cannot establish the existence of consciousness, why it should be there. It's rather that if you start with the premises of micropsychism, you end up with an incoherence, namely that the combination of subjects in particular is positively unintelligible, and therefore that it is strictly impossible, right? It's that it can be demonstrated that actually on these premises, you cannot get macro level experience. In other words, there is no possible world in which subjects combine. If you, there is no possible world in which subjects combine. Now, I won't get into the polemics and the various reasons why to prefer one to the other, but I endorse the second interpretation. I think it gives a more proper analysis and also points the finger into a deeper level of analyzing the root source of the problem. So I'll try to give you a taste of that, okay? Okay, so first thing, something about constitution and inclusion. Remember these two terms were there already on the first slide. Well, micropsychism, or more technically constitutive micropsychism, is a view which is committed to these two assumptions. First of all, what is constitution? Well, essentially the idea is that for any macro subject, let's call it M, there is a collection of micro subjects, M1, M2, and so on, such that these micro subjects collectively constitute the macro subject as the subject that it is, and they do so in virtue of their own subjective properties. The last condition is important because we are not just talking about the manner in which us and our own brains and our own organism is constituted of cells physically, right? But we're talking also here about psychological, mental constitution, right? The constitution in virtue of being subjects. The second condition is inclusion, which is the idea that the micro subjects, M1, M2, and so on, survive and endure as subjects within the compound subject which they constitute. Okay, so we have, they're both constituted and they remain themselves as part of it. Perhaps it is inspired by the notion that just as bricks survive in walls, or cells survive in tissues, or hydrogen molecules survive in water, hydrogen atoms survive in water molecules, and so on. Now, unfortunately, the combination of these two conditions generates incoherence, or so I would argue. And let's see, why is that? Okay, so the incoherence of subject combination. The first step is this. If you think of subject and you ask yourself, what are they? Well, that's a very big question. But one thing which seems rather intuitive is that subjects are fundamentally characterized by having subjective perspectives, right? And by this, I mean, to be a perspectival subject, roughly speaking, is to be, we can simply say that it's to be a center or locus of consciousness, of experience, such that, or to whom things are presented, right? Presented from a particular point of view. So, center of consciousness and a particular point of view, a point of view which is limited, constrained in interesting ways. That's essentially having a subjective perspective. I say much more about it in the paper and in other papers as well. But this will do for now. Now, but the idea that two micro-subjects can join their perspectives, let's call the perspectives P1 and P2, to yield a macro-subject with a unified perspective, capital P, that idea, I think, is contradictory, and there are several others of the same opinion as myself. Why is it contradictory? Why does it lead us to this epistemic bankruptcy? Essentially, the key here is that if you have incompatible perspectives and they continue to exist in one single locus, let's say, simultaneously, then that leads to a contradiction. So I'll just try quickly to perhaps illustrate it more. Wait a second. How do I go out of the sharing? Stop share. Okay, yeah. And we will need to share something else. Can you see this one? No, right?
I don't see it yet.
Don't see it yet. So I'll just share. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Now. All right. So we were talking about perspectives. One thing here is this. In order to illustrate the idea, make it more intuitive, in a recent paper with a co-author, we were trying to think of perspectives in more geometrical terms, and that requires the simplification. Okay, it's an artifice, it's a simplification, but we just feign that we can think of perspectives predominantly in visual terms, right? And once we do this, you can think of a perspective as something that involves, right? We said that the perspective is a limited sort of point of view. We call it, we say that every perspective has a compass, which is essentially the purview or the boundary of that individual perspective, right? So if you think of the rays here of this triangle, the rays define a compass. Everything that falls within that is part of that perspective of this individual. The second thing is that each perspective also has what we call an anchor point. Here it's the vertex of this triangle, right? Which is just the center point from which the self essentially, that's the center of the perspective from which it issues. Okay, so we think in these terms. Now, essentially we want to say that every two individuals which have the same identical anchor point and compass are thereby identical. They have the same conscious perspective. Right. Now you could have two subjects that have the same compass, right? But here they don't have the same anchor point, the same center. They look from different orientations, and that's obviously not the same. They have different perspectives. Now, if you try to think how perspectives combine, right? Well, you could, one way which we think is not at all promising is if you try to combine two micro perspectives such that they do not share an anchor point, right? So in this diagram, you can see these two micro perspectives and the bigger macro perspectives. Presumably they constitute it, but you can see that if they don't share a single anchor point, there's no connection between this perspective and that, and the smaller ones. It appears that they make no contribution to the macro perspective. It's not even clear in what sense they can really be part of it. What makes much better sense initially is the idea that somehow they may come to pull themselves together and conjoin so as to create a larger angle, to create a unified center, which we find here, right, with two micro perspectives, P1 and P2, and a macro perspective, P. But here we see the devil in the details. Here we get to the problem of contradiction, because remember that P1 and P2 constitute the larger perspective, and we also assume that they're included in it, right? Now take, for example, just perspective P1. its contribution to the bigger perspective, to P there, is essentially in terms of its own perspectivality, right? That's the relevant contribution. Now, if it remains within P, right, we get the idea that P is constituted in part out of P1, which means that in viewing things, and looking at the world from the macro perspective, P, you thereby also simultaneously looking at the world from a more narrower perspective, P1. And of course, we can see that P1 doesn't include P2. P, on the other hand, does include it. So we have both includes and not including a certain experiential region, and that's a contradiction. Okay, so that's basically the idea of how we derive contradiction, simply from assuming that perspectives combine and subjects combine. Okay, so I'll go back to the slides, and we get to the third part, which is deconstructing the decombination problem. Okay, now we move to speak about Cosmopsychism and focus more on it after having said what we had to say about Microcytism. So we can ask, assuming Cosmopsychism, right, are ordinary subjects the result of a decombination process, just the mirror image of combination of subjects? I think there are good reasons for skepticism. First of all, decombination presupposes just the term decombination, right? What is decombined was before combined. What is decomposed was before composed. So it presupposes that cosmic consciousness is necessarily a mereological whole or compositional whole. In other words, that it is composed, cosmic consciousness is composed of lesser experiential beings. Now, there definitely are some variants of Cosmopsychism that assume that assumption. But let's look at some problems. First of all, and I think that's rather intuitive, if cosmic consciousness is constitutive of lesser selves, why should it logically depend on their existence, right? It's supposed to generate them. How come and why should it depend on their existence? And it's certainly the case if you want to push the analogy with micropsychism, because note that micropsychism assumes that the prior existence of microsubjects, right? If you assume that little electrons or atoms or molecules or cells constitute our own consciousness, obviously you have an ontology in which they exist first and then they combine, right? So why should we assume, right, that in the case of cosmic consciousness, the parts must already be there from the get-go? Seems odd. The second problem is that, well, why should Cosmopsychism imply mereological monism, that sort of view, given that there are other options which are no less attractive, perhaps I would argue more attractive? So there is this thing I call generative monism. I can't go into it in details, but I'll just say the gist of the idea, which is essentially that it's a kind of monism on which the many are dynamically generated from the one, where the one, right, is assumed to be a formless and undifferentiated whole. So you start with some kind of maybe a field, maybe something that is undifferentiated, but has the capacity to generate within itself, to give rise by whatever mechanism to a plurality of inner differentiations, which some of them eventually become what we call independent or autonomous entities. So, so I think generative monism is an attractive option. You can argue for it from both scientific and philosophical grounds, but I think you can find it in some of the older religions of the world, serious traces of it. And at any rate, my own brand of Cosmopsychism is committed to it. And again, I don't think that that should be excluded right from the start on dubious ground. Okay. Now let's say something about constitution without inclusion, okay, to pursue the differences here. Recall that micropsychism faces the, what is we call it? Well, the incoherence charge, because it combines those assumptions of constitution and inclusion, namely that M1 and M2 both constitute a larger subject and are phenomenally present in it. Now, in contrast, generative cosmopsychism severs the tie between the two. Lesser subjects, first of all, lesser subjects are included in cosmic consciousness on this story, but they do not constitute it, right? While on the other hand, cosmic consciousness constitutes lesser subjects, but it is not included in them. I mean, you could say that cosmic consciousness may be immanent, right? But it's not, and certainly if you think that it has a perspective, for those of you who go that direction, the bigger, right, the larger perspective is certainly not included in the smaller one. Right, so where does it leave us with incoherence? I think that given the above analysis, there are good reasons to doubt that cosmopsychism must suffer the same fate as constitutive micropsychism. Nonetheless, many believe that it does, right? You find it a lot in the literature. Namely, I guess they suppose that whether or not the individuation problem mirrors the combination problem, we are still left with a problem that is just as dire, just as serious, just as insolvable. And essentially because the idea is that it still generates its own incoherence. So in the next and final section, I will consider this charge and attempt to respond to it, all right? So bear with me for one more section, please. Okay, so part 4, facing up to the incoherence challenge. Okay, let's take a look first at an argument which we can call the argument from transparency. Interestingly, like many other arguments, especially in the vicinity of panpsychism, it can be traced to William James. I think it's in a pluralistic universe. So William James makes an argument which is adopted with some modifications much more recently by Muriel Bahari, and they essentially present the following argument. Well, for any subject S, if S, the idea is that if that subject is embedded in cosmic consciousness, then S's experiences are transparent to cosmic consciousness. They are revealed to it, right? In other words, the idea is that cosmic consciousness experiences those experiences, the experiences of the individual subjects that are embedded in it, and experiences it essentially as its own, okay? And this, of course, I mean, once you start looking at it, you can see that that yields absurdity and discord, mental chaos, right? Essentially incoherence. Well, first of all, cosmic consciousness, as James says, right, and Miri, on that assumption, it must experience certain undignified experiences such as terror, uncertainty, doubt, right? The whole gamut of human experience. And we don't usually associate it with infinite or cosmic. Certainly not if we associate it with something like a divine entity, right? Now, in James' argument, there are interesting things here if you think in the perspective of philosophy of religion and so on, right? If something like God knows everything about your own thoughts and so on, it raises also a problem for freedom of the will. But I mean, this kind of objection, you could say, well, that may be weird, but it's not necessarily a knockdown argument. But it does get worse because cosmic consciousness, if you think, right, if it experiences all our experiences, well, some of us has, for example, an attitude towards our own mortality, which is fearful, right? And we react with terror. Others may react with stoic calm. Others may even wish for it, right? And these are obviously, incompatible. Now, if we imagine a poor kind of consciousness that just absorbs all of these things as its own, and it's all just buzz around there, that's a mess, right? Just a bunch of unrelated propositions, which may often be rather contradictory. So again, we get to the idea that incompatible perspectives is at the heart of the problem, right? They are the one that breed contradiction. And the claim here, of course, is that Cosmopsychism would get that result as well. But is it an argument which is applicable across the board? Is it really a general argument against Cosmopsychism? Well, some variants of Cosmopsychism appear to be clearly vulnerable to this critique. I mean, I think Miri thinks, and I agree with her on that Philip Goff's, what's the name of it? Subsumptive model, right? Suffers from this result, essentially because it's the idea that cosmic consciousness subsumes all conscious states of all other creatures under its wings, so to speak. It's a bit like a sentence that contains substantial parts in it, right? Okay, but there are other models, there are other theories, and so there are others, and myself included, who do not endorse this assumption of transparency. Instead, we assume that ordinary subjects are more like sealed pockets, right? Some kind of, at least to a significant degree, sealed pockets within cosmic consciousness, sealed envelopes, or that their experiences, consequently, our experiences, are hidden from sight from the perspective of the cosmic consciousness. All right, so we have a difference here. Nevertheless, Al-Bahari argues that this latter position is equally indefensible. So here again, I need to first stop the share and just quickly move to our alternative document here. Can you see it now?
Yes, I see it.
Yes, okay. All right, well, Al-Bahari basically argues that this position finds itself caught in an inconsistent tetrad, right? 4 assumptions that are inconsistent with each other. Well, the first one is that cosmic consciousness is a perspectival subject, right? As we said before, a subject with its own perspective. The second assumption, that's a direct quotation from her, is that part of what it means to be a conscious subject is for any content within its field of consciousness of that subject, right, to be disclosed to its first personal perspective. So any content within the field of that subject has to be disclosed to it. The third assumption is that the contents of our conscious fields are embedded within the conscious field of cosmic consciousness, right? And the fourth is that nonetheless, the contents of our conscious fields are hidden from cosmic consciousness, as I just argued or suggested before. Now, of course, here that's unsustainable, inconsistent, and so she argues that we get into a dilemma, because you either have to give up premise 4 and embrace transparency, right? Against your will, perhaps, but then we are back with the original incoherence, and that's bad news. Or alternatively, she argues the other option is to give up number 1, which is the idea that cosmic consciousness is a perspectival subject. But here she argues that that's a basic commitment of Cosmopsychism. So once you do that, you're no longer a Cosmopsychist. You obviously pay a price. All right. So where were we? Okay, so I want just finally to consider 2 responses to this. And the first response is that cosmic consciousness need not necessarily be a perspectival subject, right? We know that cosmic consciousness must ground the subjectivity of lesser subjects, right? If you're a cosmopsychist, you basically say cosmic consciousness is the beginning of our story and everything else has somehow non-trivially to depend on it, right? Our own subjectivity has to depend on it in a non-trivial sense. But to do so, it needs cosmic consciousness, right? In order to perform that job, it need not be a perspectival subject. Well, if you go that way, you essentially argue against premise 1, P1. To do the job, cosmic consciousness must minimally, I argue it in my Cosmopsychism paper of 2015, that it must, in order for our consciousness, our subjective selves to depend on the cosmic ground, that ground must confer upon us, right, certain what I call generic features. They're not individual; they're generic features. It must be in virtue of cosmic consciousness that there are such things such as sentience, right, providing us with this basic capacity for sentience, for conscious receptivity, which is essentially the idea of being the dative of experience, right? The addressee, that to whom experiences are given. You could add other things such as will or whatnot, but it would be a small list of certain generic features. And presumably, for this, all of this could be accomplished even by what we may call a pure subject, right? A subject which is non-perspectival, which is a center of experience, but it is not non-perspectival in the sense that it doesn't have any limited point of view, a limited portal on the world that is constrained by all sorts of things. It may simply be a center of experience and sentience and so on, in the sense that is often described in our context as a pure subject. And for the basic performance, that could be done equally well. That's the argument. So it is doubtful that cosmic consciousness must, or even that it could be, a perspectival subject. I mean, if you think of it, the perspective is something that is limiting already, or the most exalted being may not be limited in that kind of way, right? So I think there are serious reasons to think that, to take that sort of route, and I did it before in a paper with Joachim Kepler a few years ago, 2018. All right, so this is one way, but in the present paper, the last one on which this talk is based, I was actually pursuing a different direction. And that's the last thing I'll touch upon here. It's a second response, which essentially says that incoherence can be avoided anyhow, even without giving up on the notion that cosmic, even if you leave, the debate whether cosmic consciousness has to have a perspective or not. Let's assume that it does have a perspective. Even so, there is no strict incoherence demonstrated. So let us assume that cosmic consciousness is perspectival. We embrace premise 1. Still, in this case, what can be contested is the second premise, P2. Well, we can ask, must all contents within the field of consciousness of the cosmic mind, must all of these contents be disclosed to it, merely in virtue of being somehow embedded in that field? Why can't there be hidden pockets, right? And here are just two counters that I wish to think here in response, right? One is just an approximation, some sort of thought experiment to fix our intuition first. So think of something that is, we may call it a universal observer, right? Imagine that you had this power that you could look throughout the entire expanse of the universe, right? Space-time. Would such a creature be able to peep into black holes, right? So black holes are located in our universe, essentially, right? But there are nevertheless certain spots that are hidden from sight, right? That we cannot peep into. Okay, but we don't need to go there that far and talk about black holes in this sense, because our own visual fields, as a matter of fact, contain hidden spots. It contains blind spots, right? And blind spots are precisely regions, are defined actually as regions of one's visual field, which are obscured from sight to various degrees, sometimes to a total obscuration. And so if that's the case, well, why can't there be such regions within cosmic consciousness? Of course, that's a bit of a strange idea in the sense that we do not expect ourselves to have, little creatures hidden behind our own blind spots, right? But cosmic consciousness need not be exactly, what applies for us, not 100% applies for it. And the important thing here, I think, is simply the principle that there could be regions which are hidden from sight and nevertheless are within the purview of that consciousness. So why can't we think of subjects, right? Essentially, my suggestion is that we can think of subjects as proverbial blind spots within cosmic consciousness. So there is one substance which has this sentience, has this fundamental subjectivity and so on. Of course, you have to describe a certain mechanism. This is left out of this particular paper, of how there is differentiation, right? Why the creation of these little folds, right? And that could be either because they are by some process of self-absorption, or we used metaphors of vortices, or there are different kinds of account for it. But right now, for me, what's important is just the general principle that there could be proverbial blind spots within the purview of a cosmic consciousness. And so embeddedness within CC's field of consciousness does not imply, I would argue, does not imply transparent disclosure. And if that's the case, there is no incoherence that can be demonstrated as a matter of principle. And so, yeah, that's essentially the point. And I think with that we can summarize. And to say in summary that incoherence results from the coupling of constitution and inclusion, that micropsychism is committed to such coupling, that cosmopsychism isn't, that the transparency argument can be deflected, regardless of whether or not we assume cosmic consciousness to be a perspectival subject, right? And consequently, well, life is good. Thank you for your time and your patience.
Thank you, Professor Shani, for your fascinating, your brilliant talk. I have lots of, I wouldn't say questions, but comments, but I'm going to keep them and give others the chance to speak first. Primarily, I want our students to have the first go at questions or comments. So postgraduate students, undergraduate students, anyone who is out there, you can ask your question. If you can find the hand up function, that's ideal. It should be under the reactions button. You click the reactions button and there's a raise hand function. And if you raise your hand, you can ask your question. I see also there's a chat box function. I would prefer for you to lift up your hand. I see two hands, yay. Two hands. I'm going with the order I see them on the screen. Jason Frankel first. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Jason.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Itai. Thank you. Your work has been quite influential to me.
I cannot hear you very terribly well. Could you please try?
Okay.
That's much better.
Now.
I have taken out my headphones. I don't know if that's any better. Okay, great. So you started the talk speaking about the relationship between physicalism and panpsychism. Am I losing you now? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes. Physicalism and panpsychism.
Okay. So it seems like physicalism suffers from the move from the physical to the mental, and you're starting with the mental.
Yeah.
Can you?
Jason, your connection seems to be poor. Maybe you want to just use audio and turn off video.
I'll post my comments.
Okay, that will work as well.
Okay.
Thank you for yeah.
Is that any better? Can you hear me?
That is, we can hear you. Yes.
Okay. So briefly, I'm just wondering if you can discuss how you see the physical fitting into cosmopsychism. How is the world of space-time generated?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's also a big question, right? And look, I think there are just two different pointers I can say. On the one hand, I'm kind of like, in some sense, I'm gravitated towards a more, more in the direction of idealism, right? Which is basically, and for me, it's basically motivated by, one major reason is that if you think of the panpsychist claim that this whole argument about the intrinsic nature of matter and so on, right? And the idea that this intrinsic nature, these quidditas have to be, constituted somehow, and then the idea that perhaps it is phenomenal properties, it's consciousness that constitute this essential, this intrinsic nature, right? Well, I ask, what else is there, right? If you say in itself it's consciousness, right? Many say, well, the outside is physical and so on. But I mean, for me, it follows from that logic that the outside is simply a phenomenon. It's simply an image, right? So that leads in a direction of just melding panpsychism, taking it in the direction of idealism, and try to build a metaphysics where the whole of the physical world is seen as in some sense a construction within consciousness. Now there are obviously many difficult questions here, right? How do you take things such as fields and so on and reconstruct within an idealist interpretation? But I don't think there's any inconsistencies here. The challenge is more with our intuitions. I mean, many people think that causation would be in serious trouble and so on, right? On the other hand, you have philosophers such as Whitehead who argued long ago, and he wasn't the first, that something like our emotions are actually the inner, what we experience as energy from the outside is emotion from the inside. So I think there are lots of interesting resources to try to build a consistent ontology that is essentially made out of experience, right? I'm sorry, I don't have anything more specific than that at the moment.
Thanks, Itai. Two more questions. First, Emma, and then Ethan. Emma, and then Ethan.
Thank you very much. Good morning from Lagos, Nigeria. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, please. I'm speaking from Lagos, Nigeria, and Professor Shani, thank you for that wonderful talk. And I also have to thank the University of Johannesburg for putting this up. Yeah, I would want to make some questions and also provide some comments. I hope Professor Shani will be able to provide the answers to, because my doctoral defense is due in less than 2 weeks. And that's precisely the motivation for joining this talk. I would like Professor Shani to please enlighten us concerning the difference between consciousness and experience. That's question number one. Question number two, I would also want Professor Shani to consider what Whitehead calls pan-experientialism. and what David Chalmers calls proto-panpsychism, and try to locate whether each of these scholars would conform to a cosmic panpsychism or a micro-panpsychism.
So sorry, I think I missed part of this question. So there was Chalmers on panpsychism, but before that, you said Whitehead on what? Yeah.
The terminology that Whitehead would use for panpsychism is pan-experientialism. That's what Whitehead uses, yes. And then David Chalmers uses pan-proto-panpsychism. Pan-proto-panpsychism.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, from David Chalmers. So I was asking if either of Whitehead or Chalmers would have subscribed to a cosmic panpsychism or a micro panpsychism, right? And the third question concerns the ontological background that you are using to assess the problems of cosmic panpsychism and micro panpsychism. Personally, I believe that a process ontology would have assisted better and mitigated the problems that your analysis are bringing up, especially from a substance point of view, where scientific materialism seems to hold. So I think it is important to situate this talk within a proper ontology, the metaphysical ontology that can make sense of reality. I think this kind of a talk, process metaphysics, would be more situated and appropriate rather than the substance metaphysics. I think you should consider that, Professor Shani.
Any specific reasons why you think this? If you can just in brief.
Yes, personally, I believe that when you're talking about the process ontology, it talks about the fact that everything is connected, everything is interdependent. Whitehead, for instance, in his pan-experientialism, believes that it is possible to take both a micro-panpsychist position and a cosmo-panpsychist position, because he believes that experience is all the way up and all the way down. And he took this idea from William James, whom you quoted. You quoted William James a while ago. And he took that from William James. Yes, he took that from William James to show that it is possible to account for consciousness rather than the imagination in scientific materialism, that all along the list of entities from the lowest to the highest, consciousness just sprung up miraculously. So Whitehead claims that we should assume that right from the micro level, consciousness was all the way from there upwards. So that would be a micro panpsychist framework. But he also admitted a cosmo panpsychist framework, because for Whitehead, it is possible for God to be able to prehend all our feelings in the world. That is what he calls the primordial nature of God.
Sorry, I think I can try to answer. I mean, the Whitehead stuff you mentioned is familiar to me.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Right. Well, I mean, there are three questions here. The first one about consciousness and experience. I'm not exactly sure. I mean, I think, to me, it seems that it's a matter of emphasis, right? When we speak about experience, it's less substantive. We tend to think more of particular experiences, though we have a general term as experience as such. But consciousness is usually, right? We tend to think of something that is more enduring or more unified and so on. Other than that, I don't have any interesting answer to say in that sense. I mean, what the difference between consciousness and experience? Perhaps you take it, perhaps your thought behind it is because you then, that's your second question. I mean, that brings me to the second question, where you speak about Whitehead pan-experientialism, right? And the idea that certain people say, make a lot of the distinction between panpsychism versus pan-experientialism. So maybe I'll say something there. And my daughter is checking out on me. Sorry. Well, she's 7-year-old. It's okay. Yeah. So where were we? I'm not sure. I mean, look, about Whitehead's first of all, pan-experientialism is not a term due to Whitehead. It's Whiteheadians, right? It's Whitehead scholars that invented this term, I believe. I wouldn't make much of it. I mean, I think I don't think they have good reasons to focus on pan-experientialism as opposed to panpsychism. I think Whitehead has a very specific term for consciousness, not terribly well motivated, certainly not the term that most people understand. He think of it as something very much more cognitive, which involves judgment. It's not the raw fields of consciousness, which scholars tend to speak about today. So if you bear this in mind, I really don't see much of a difference, and I would stick with a term like panpsychism, right? You mentioned Chalmers. Now, Chalmers mentioned two different alternatives, panpsychism and the ugly term pan-protopsychism, right? Or proto-phenomenalism. That's a different thing, because unlike Whitehead's pan-experientialism, Chalmers' sub-panpsychism, right? That's a view that entities, the basic entities, the fundamental constituents of nature, are not subjects of experience. Not because they're not subjects, but because also they don't have any experience. So I think that's a very obscure kind of view. It's a view that I haven't seen anyone developing in any detail, perhaps with the possible exception of Sam Coleman and panqualityism. I have little sympathy for it, but Chalmers just suggested it. He doesn't really endorse it either way. So the last thing is just about the question of why I'm not framing my discussion more in terms of process philosophy. First, I'm very much sympathetic to various kinds of process philosophies, including, of course, Whitehead. I love Whitehead, but I'm not convinced, and I don't think the way I like to frame things is actually anti-process view. In fact, it's very much influenced. If you read, my paper, my two major papers on the subject both involves elements of process thinking, essentially. But I tend to have differences with some process philosophers. First of all, I don't think that it makes much sense to think that there is a world of, that things are fundamentally just processes, right? The demise of a substance metaphysics in some capacity seems to me to be premature. The contrast exaggerated as well. I just don't want to take too much time, so I think I'll stop with that. But by all means, my work in recent years has been influenced by certain elements, which I take selectively from Whitehead that I really love and appreciate, while keeping some disagreements as well.
Thanks for that, Professor Shani. Emma applauds you. Ethan, you can go ahead, and then it's Clarice. Ethan,
Prof.
go ahead.
Thanks for your talk. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Prof. Just generally, could you comment on how your work sort of fits into the field of artificial intelligence and how that's sort of
sorry, how it fits into? Try to be a little bit louder.
Sorry, how it fits into the field of artificial intelligence.
Okay, more specifically, maybe.
I suppose the sort of emergent properties of where you would see, well, more specifically, like your top-down and bottom-up analogies, where you would see artificial intelligence fitting into those
Right.
two categories.
Ethan, may I try to rephrase that for you? So I suspect, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I suspect that what you see is that there are programmers trying to manifest, let's say, quote unquote, artificial intelligence. And the speaker's view is that intelligence is consciousness is this top-down phenomenon. And you're wondering how those two fit. It's sort of like consciousness is already there, and with artificial intelligence, the idea is to create consciousness. I think that's what Ethan is trying to express, and I'm struggling to express it too, because there seems to be some issue there with how consciousness is understood in the artificial intelligence sense.
Right. Well, I mean, in that sense, I'm not sure there's. in that sense, I'm not sure the fact that it is kind of like assumed, and that doesn't seem to be a problem, right? Whatever your view about the metaphysical foundation of consciousness, the challenge here is more practical in the sense of what are the proper mechanisms. And notice that I spoke very little, maybe not at all, about specific mechanisms here, right? There are other papers where I talk more, for whatever it's worth. But you know, it's a question of principles. On what principles you'd hope to create, to artificially generate, right, a system that would actually be a locus of consciousness. And I think the problem is more with certain fundamental assumptions of artificial intelligence. One of them, you know, one dominant assumption, I'm not sure it's essential, right? But the dominant assumption has always been that minds are some kind of machines. And I've always objected to that in thinking that it's the wrong kind of organization. That machines are really, it's part of the logic of a machine that it's really more bottom-up sort of approach where the elements have to exist independently of each other. You know, you can take them also apart from the machine, right? And they continue to exist. It's very much different than an organism. I think that's a massive problem for artificial intelligence, despite things such as robotics and so on, and all sorts of approximation to a more biological kind of level. There's a fundamental question here. But otherwise, I mean, it's just a question. You know, if you believe that the mechanism that generates consciousness at various levels, right, whether micro or macro, is something like, for example, quantum coherence, then, you know, there's no reason in principle where that couldn't be generated artificially, right? So I think, you know, a lot of it depends on what we understand by artificial intelligence.
Thank you, Professor. Ethan, I hope I didn't mangle your question, and I hope that the response was satisfying.
Yes, no, yeah, thank you for sort of clarifying it.
Thanks for the question. Oh,
would you say artificial or like human level consciousness would ever be possible synthetically through the machine? Sorry,
I don't think we heard that. There was a. Oh, can you please repeat that?
Did it break up? Sorry. Do you think it's ever possible then that human level consciousness would be generated synthetically?
Well, I mean, if it's generated in line with more general principles in nature, then I don't see why not, right? I mean, essentially, as I said, I for many years, or I mean, my natural reaction is opposition to the idea of you know, artificial consciousness and so on, or even artificial intelligence in the genuine sense of understanding and so on, but not because of any you know, any ultimate impossibility. It's simply because artificial intelligence was wedded to the idea that minds are machines of some kind, right? And I think that's just the wrong way to look. But if you think of it more generally as you know, artificial, in simply that in the sense of fabricating something, right? Then it all depends on what are the principles. And in that sense, I don't see any particular tension for cosmopsychism or panpsychism or indeed any sort of ontology. Why should that be more, you know, any sort of a metaphysical background assumptions? I don't see why that should be more difficult or, you know, less probable than something like physicalism for the practical purposes of having an artificial intelligence one day.
Thanks, Ethan. Clarice, thanks for your patience. Before I ask you to go, anyone can now ask a question, students, non-students, so get your questions ready. Clarice, go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to ask about the implications. Is there any specific view of moral judgment or any implications on the nature of moral judgment from panpsychism, or does it not really give much insight into that?
So I'm struggling to hear. I'm sorry. Implications for, would you say, moral judgment? What was it?
Yes, I wanted to ask if panpsychism implies anything specific about the nature of morality.
Clarice, are you specifically focusing on panpsychism or cosmopsychism, which is Professor Shani's expertise or preferred view?
Yeah, he can answer it for cosmopsychism maybe.
Okay.
Okay, but Achille, could you quickly repeat? I mean, just to make sure that I answer the right question here.
Yes. So you've given us the view of you've given us the metaphysical view. This is reality. It is consciousness. And Clarice wants to know how that impacts upon the moral sphere of life. Let me just, I know that you understand the question, but just to give some audience, some background to the audience. So in religious traditions in which this sort of view is proposed, there's also an idea that there's a moral framework within creation. And that moral framework gives creation a hierarchy of values, and a subject should orient herself, himself toward these properly within this hierarchy. So basically, I guess that's a question. Where does morality fit into this cosmopsychist picture?
Right. Oh, wonderful question. I mean, that I'm a bit humbled by it. You know, I guess I can say two things. One is more general. You know, so many people that are sympathetic to panpsychism, often in connection also with environmental philosophy, right, argue obviously that, you know, it makes a difference once you think of the whole world as being suffused with consciousness, right? And that changes, that is potentially can fundamentally change our attitude towards nature, which, as you know, is identified as, well, it's a big problem nowadays and has cultural conditionalization, to be sure. So that is one element, but more specifically, more specifically to cosmopsychism and to my own recent concerns, I think that, yeah, I mean, I think something like cosmopsychism, I'm actually now try to work out to connect this interest in cosmopsychism with an interest in the question of the meaning of life. So it's not exactly maybe morality right away, but we are in the neighborhood, right, of values and meaningfulness. And one of the things that attract me is this idea that, as I understand meaning, I think when you have a meaningful experience or a meaningful period in your life or something like this, or otherwise when it's non-meaningful, when it falls apart, when you go astray, there's always the idea that the meaningful is when you're more centered, right? That is the heart of the matter. And for me, I think cosmopsychism or a view like that opens up the possibility that the center of the self is actually connected to a deeper center, right? Which is, you know, you could say the divine or you know, a cosmic level, super personal, and so on. And that I think opens fascinating vistas in for example, in thinking about meaning. And likewise, I'm sure if you ask more specifically about moral implications. Yeah.
So basically, watch the space. Other questions? Thank you, Clarice. I hope that is a satisfying answer. I don't see you on the screen anymore. I hope you haven't lost your connection. So anyone can, Clarice, I see you there. Clarice gives a thumbs up. Thank you, Professor, for that response. Yeah, no questions so far. I see Velimitova. Please ask your question.
Hi, Proshani. Welcome to you, too. Yeah, so I don't work in this area, and I'm a hardcore physicalist nonetheless. But I agree with you about the most plausible way to take in defending cosmopsychism So that looks like the most promising place. In fact, I'd like already scribbled deny too, right? And as an epistemologist, we don't usually, we don't think that perspectives are open in the way that people seem to do, right? Completely available to us. So I agree with that. I was wondering about the alternative response that you mentioned, denying one in the tetrad. If one went for that, wouldn't that undermine your argument for the incoherence of the combination of constitution and inclusion? So if we deny that, if we think that perspectives are no longer necessary, then your neat little cool pictures kind of drop out of the picture because, well, the composite entity, right, needn't have a perspective.
Yeah. Well, you're perfectly right. I mean, in asking about it, right, in pointing the finger there, but it's, well, I would argue that it's mostly because of what I left out of this talk. It's originally there were two assumptions there. One is the one I touched upon, which is the idea that the cosmic ground provides this what I call basic sentience and basic selfhood, or right. I mean, being a dative of experience and all of that. The generic features that I talked about, but so if you ask, well, what about the individual perspectives? If I understand you correctly, right? I mean, my claim is that those in this, the specifications, right, the particularities of individual perspectives are the result of all sorts of constraints, which they are not directly conferred by cosmic consciousness as a cosmic consciousness. I mean, obviously, if cosmic consciousness is the matrix within which everything develops, then of course it depends on cosmic consciousness, but not qua a subject of experience. I think it's a point that's been missed by some people. So the idea is that, well, you have your own perspective that depends on all sorts of things, on memory, on attitude, on your cultural and geographical situatedness, and specification of embodiment, the structure of your sense organs, and so on and so forth, right? These are all different prisms that when they act together, they create your own specific portal to the world, which is different than mine, which is different than an ant, different than a whale, right? Different than aliens and so on. It's just an added part of the story. Now, I mean, I don't know if that's how it relates to your initial concern. I thought that was the issue.
May I follow up, Ash?
Yes, you may.
Thanks. That makes sense. I was just, I guess what I was thinking is that if you deny that cosmic consciousness needs to have a perspective, right? You're denying, aren't you denying that then the macro subject has to have a perspective? In which case, the idea that that perspective can't be the congregate of the individual ones, because they might, in your diagram, might point in different directions, no longer works.
Right. So I'm not sure I follow this 100%, but I know that there are these concerns, right? And it's part of that. I mean, Ayon Maharaj and other, well, he's a scholar of Indian philosophy and so on, but also has his own articulation of Cosmopsychism recently. And he worries about that, right? He thinks that the ground has to be perspectival. I mean, so my point was that I think even if you assume that, then you could, there is a response. But I still don't, I mean, I don't see why, especially since, I mean, the story could be more complicated, right? If you take something like Neoplatonism, for example, right? And even in Indian philosophy, but let's say Neoplatonism, there are different stages, right? You have the stage, the higher part, the one which is more like Nirguna Brahman, completely beyond all qualities, completely unqualified. In that sense, a perspective is a qualification already. It's a limitation on one's, there's something that's left out. And then if there are various other stages, if there's something later that is more like a cosmic mind that issues out of this, and only then, who knows, right? I think it's just might be a complicated story. But for me, it's just hard to see why if the idea has simply been that as a subject you need to have a center of you are the addressee, you are the one who's the center of experience to whom things appear, right? So if things don't appear, if in a situation like Muriel Bahari argues, right, where you could take these things away, and sometimes in meditation there is the claim that that's what happens, right? That all the thoughts and all the objects and everything, right, and it's all sort of like quiets down, and the perspective dissipates, but there's still this self-illuminating, or there's something there, right? The presence of consciousness. It's that kind of view that I try to make sense of, and I'm still open about the question of perspective. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Matova. We're about time, Itai, out of time, Itai Shani, Professor Itai Shani. I just want to offer you some thoughts. When you were speaking, I was thinking of analogies that could help you. And I think you do a fine job of responding to the various concerns with Cosmopsychism. I was thinking about how consciousness manifests itself in us. So we can speak about the consciousness of a crowd, for example, which can be distinct from the consciousness of individuals within that crowd. And you could have what is it called? This crowd psychology, but I'm thinking of something. The term is escaping me right now, but there's this possibility that I didn't see in your opponents when they were describing how experience it works within subjects, and their proposal in terms of how it's problematic to then speak about a cosmopsychist framework in which experience could be understood. I was also thinking about one of the issues with the idea that cosmic consciousness could be conscious of all of our subjective experiences, and the kind of trauma on a cosmic scale that could manifest there. But empathy is useful here. So you can think of how it is possible for us to, in a sense, feel the suffering of another while not suffering that suffering. So that's a possible objection to the idea that cosmic consciousness is I don't remember how many exactly you phrased it, but that cosmic consciousness. Sorry?
Talking about empathy, or
yeah, I was just thinking, let me just look at exactly where that fit in your this is you were objecting to that idea, but it's look, I can't find it right now, but the suggestion is that cosmic consciousness does not need to be traumatized. If there's such a thing as cosmic consciousness, it does not need to be traumatized by the fact that they are traumatized individual subjects within that cosmic consciousness. Right. Because there's a perspective that cosmic, quote unquote, perspective that cosmic consciousness could take on the individual perspectives. And one last thing, and you mentioned, like you mentioned, Nirguna Brahman, that step that Advaita Vedanta takes, in which all that remains is consciousness. And any attempt to actually Satchin Ananda, being consciousness, bliss, and any attempt to speak about the quality of experience is reducing that Brahman to something that it is not. So your opponents are trying to speak about consciousness from a very, well, let me not attack a straw man here, but it's necessary to use analogies that are understandable to us. But it's plausible, and you do make this point, it's plausible that cosmic consciousness is something beyond what it is we subjectively experience. It's beyond our subjective experience.
Right.
Yeah, it's sort of like we're using our framework of experience to try to understand an experience that may be beyond what we consider to be intelligible.
you could basically put it by saying, in some sense, just as in theology, in something like the concept of God, right? I mean, it's a limit concept in many ways. And limits are always the place where a lot of the things that our framework in some sense break, right?
Yes.
You can never really match one-to-one. It's, yeah. Yes, thanks. All of these points are useful. And I might just say that about the notion of not being traumatized. I mean, the idea that cosmic consciousness may actually have access to those experiences, right? I mean, I guess that's what you're suggesting. Yeah, I'm even that is an open question for me. It's not, I pursue other lines, but I still think about it as a living option as well, right? And I know that there are interesting places in literature, like in Indian philosophy and so on, where you can see this kind of thing. Definitely in the idea of witness consciousness, right? So yeah, I think there might be that's another line that's possible to develop. I don't consider it impossible by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, and I think it's a very rich and fruitful ground for research, and I'm glad that we have you on to speak about it as one of the pioneers of this understanding of consciousness, at least in the contemporary analytic tradition. I greatly enjoy your work, and I've greatly enjoyed this discussion. Thank you for taking the time to speak to us, and all the best.
Thank you, Achille, and thank you all. Thanks. It was really enjoying for me, and I hope also for you.
We are getting applause in this strange new world. People are using their clap function, so there is silent applause.
All right.
Thank you, Professor Itai Shani. Keep well, and thanks everybody. Thanks for joining.